Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. Today, we're continuing our election coverage, specifically talking about the stakes of state races before a budget year. But first, a historic presidential moment. 10 years since a sitting president visited Indian country. President Biden traveled to Arizona to make the first formal public apology for our nation's 150-year-long campaign to force Native American children to give up their culture. Take a listen.
Quite frankly, there's no excuse that this apology took 50 years to make. Lost generations, culture and language, lost trust. It's horribly, horribly wrong. It's a sin on our soul.
The boarding school policy established in the 19th century forcibly separated children from their families. It took away their names, language, hair, traditions. There was systemic abuse and thousands died. This morning, we're sitting down with the Mashantucket Pequot's tribal chairman, Rodney Butler, who was one of the few who was able to actually fly with President Biden to speak with him and to go and see this apology firsthand. Rodney, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Emma.
So I do want to hear about that trip. I do want to get into that, such a historic moment and gathering. But first, we spoke about the history of those Native American boarding schools, and Native people here in Connecticut are no stranger to forced assimilation in many ways, and even still continuing today. For your tribe, the Pequot War in the 1600s, really splintered the people. You're here at our studio here in Hartford, and the Treaty of Hartford centuries ago basically said your ancestors could no longer exist. I know there's been healing and federal recognition for the Mashantuckets, but how important is remembering and reckoning with some of that erasure?
Incredibly important. I think the wounds still run deep, right. Especially when I'm speaking with my elders, and they remember how they were ashamed or afraid to speak their language and let people know that they were Native American, because the policies of assimilation that were going on, as we talked about with the boarding schools for that 150-year period, that not only impacted those natives that were brought to those schools, but also Native communities around the country, including ours and Mohegan and others throughout New England that faced that assimilation hundreds of years prior to. Because the premise of those boarding schools was really rooted in the colonization of this region of the country. Right. And that policy of assimilation and attempted erasure began with the Pequot War, as you noted, and the Treaty of Hartford that said, I can no longer speak my language, I can't call myself Pequot, enslaved us to neighboring villages, colonies, and the like. That was the foundation that 100+ years later then transitioned into the boarding school structure that then lasted for another 150 years into the 1960s, which is just fascinating to me.
Seems long ago, but is actually quite recent.
Yeah, it's in the generation of my father, right? And so it's near, and the wounds were still fresh, and that's what made that moment out at Gila River Indian community that much more important and impactful.
And I do want to talk about that. What was it like to be a part of that process, to be able to travel with the nation's leader to that land to make that apology and discuss reparations? Tell us a little bit about how that trip was, how it came about.
Yeah, so, traveling with him was kind of the secondary, actually the tertiary. It wasn't even on my mind, actually. I didn't think about that, of how historical that was, until after I got back and people started saying, hey, how was that flying on Air Force One and traveling with the president? I was like, I don't know. We were there for a reason, and that reason was for that historic apology. And in that moment, being there with 500-600 other Native community members and people that had been fighting for this for generations, people that had experienced boarding schools directly, being there in that moment was very, very moving, very sacred, and just there wasn't a dry eye in the house because it was so impactful. And then for us, again, reflecting back centuries of what happened to my ancestors, it just brought it all back home.
And some people, we've heard might say, well, you can't undo history or the past. This happened. Yeah. It's been so long now. This is just an apology. It's surface level. Why would you even still want that? What would be your response to that?
Well, because it's important to recognize it. I mean, history, good, bad, and different. We can't erase it. We shouldn't forget about it, right? And so it's simply recognizing it and admitting a wrong goes a long way. There's many times where I've been wrong or done something wrong, and the apology that I've given was it didn't change what I had done, but it certainly made the person that I offended or what have you, made them feel a lot better about it. It made them know that I was genuinely understanding that I hurt them, right. And that I cared about their feelings, and that's what this did.
Yeah, and you've been governing your tribal nation for more than a decade now, and there's been many different phases, growth periods. We even went through a pandemic a few years ago. You know, you are a federally recognized tribe, one of 2 of the federally recognized tribes here in Connecticut, and that does come with some rights, some resources, infrastructure, funding. President Biden's speech did bring up again a question, though, of what else should be done on a federal level in D.C. Is there enough support, enough recognition? What are your thoughts on that? What do you feel still needs to be done here?
Well, look, I mean, it's been, in our case, almost 400 years of assimilation, right? And taking of our rights over that time frame, taking of our land. And when you look at, I'll focus just on the Biden administration specifically. I call it one of the most important presidential administrations in the history of Indian country, because of the investments that were made in Indian country, the commitments to securing and supporting our language revitalization programs, protecting our sacred sites, getting land back in trust and returning land to our nations. I mean, we were one of the beneficiaries of that, where we added back 100+ acres back to Mashantucket that had been stripped, 150 years ago. And so all that led up to the apology. It's kind of like the capstone of this great administration. And I think people just saw this moment and they want to politicize it and say, this is all about politics. He's in Arizona. Well, no, there's a history with Gila River and what they've done and what in the relationship they've built with the president. And if it was about politics, why would a leader from Connecticut be there, right? I mean, this is the bluest blue state you can get. There's no votes he's picking up. It's not a swing state by any means. And so it just speaks of what he was able to accomplish for all of Indian country in the last 4 years, and investments that are going to last 4 generations and impact generations.
And some of those investments, there are a lot of perceptions that we hear from people that, indigenous people want to, quote unquote, take their land back or get all this government support, but we know that the resources come with recognition and also come with, real tangible things revenue-wise, which is an enormous contribution back to the state yet. Can you tell me a little bit more specifically about what that has looked like for you, especially in the past couple years?
Yeah, I'll give you context on the take your land back nonsense, right? So Pequot territory, pre-contact, just before the Pequot War, was 250 square miles. Mashantucket today sits at just under 1,700 acres, right? Barely a town park at this point. And from the colonist perspective, it was the most unusable land. It was our sacred land, sacred cedar swamp, and our ancestors were there for thousands of years. But to the colonists, it was the least usable farmland that they could give to us, and so they didn't care so much about it. But they certainly enjoyed the balance of our territory. And so it's not about getting land back and you owe us something. No, that's our land. I mean, it's really that simple. And the fact that we're only sitting on such just a grain of sand on the beach compared to what our land was in total, it's really not a lot that we've gotten back, and it shows you the amount of progress that still continues to need to be made on behalf of our nation and other nations.
And you've, been able to do a lot still with that, even though there's a lot of ground still to gain. But just a few weeks ago, we went and took the real story to the Eastern Pequot Reservation, just down the road from yours. Obviously, the tribes were divided, as we said, during the Pequot War, and they are not federally recognized. And we sort of spoke with them about the difference in resources and infrastructure and options, having that federal recognition or not. There's been a lot of effort for the tribes to gather together, to work more. Do you have any perspective, big picture here, as we talk about how the federal government can support reservation and nation rebuilding? Yeah,
I'll say, as it relates to my direct cousins of Eastern Pequot, my grandmother was on the rolls of Eastern Pequot and Western Pequot. Our communities are interrelated. The Native communities in New England are all intertwined. And so when you look at the great state-recognized tribes in Connecticut, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, they all deserve the same rights that we in Mohegan have. And I think it's very discouraging to hear some of our elected leaders who are currently fighting against them again, as they were against us 40 years ago, and as they were against specifically Eastern Pequot and Schaghticoke, who were actually federally recognized in the early 2000s.
Right.
And then the first time in history, well, modern history, they were revoked because of the lobbying of legislators in the state of Connecticut. And so they absolutely deserve federal recognition, because it's not about casinos. It's not about taking back hundreds of thousands of acres. It's simply getting access to the programs and services and the financial support that the federal government provides back to tribal nations. And they deserve it just as much as anyone else does.
And you mentioned lobbying from elected leaders, from state and federal lawmakers. You mentioned how you feel the Biden administration has done a lot for the community. Obviously, we're in an election year, very, very close to Election Day now. I know, and I want to touch on this a little bit, because obviously there's always critiques of every administration, right, regarding what they've done, what they could do better. There's a clip that's been drummed up, going viral again now, of former President Donald Trump speaking about Foxwoods, the Mashantuckets, saying you all, quote, don't look like Indians. At the same time, you were at the DNC as a delegate this year for Vice President Kamala Harris. You've been at celebrations for Indigenous leaders who have been elected to federal government roles for more representation. What do you feel is at stake from your perspective for your community in this election?
So as you noted earlier, I've been a tribal leader for almost 21 years now. I've had the privilege of being the chairman of my nation for 15 years. We are a domestic sovereign nation within the borders of Connecticut, and we have a full government that I and my council are responsible for. I have chaired through 3 different presidential administrations, through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, through the Biden administration now. And I can say hands down, the Biden administration has been the best on Native American issues, right? And it's the complexity of being a president, right? There's multiple issues that you care about. Biden appointed a Native American to head the Department of Interior, which is responsible to oversee the relations between the federal government and tribes. He selected my dear, dear friend, Chief Malerba, to be the Treasurer of the United States, the first Native American female Treasurer of the United States. And so when I first came into leadership, it was during the Obama administration. And I would say he set the foundation for Biden to launch off of. He created the White House Tribal Nations Council. He started the White House Tribal Nations Summit, which I had the honor of going to. I've spent time with him as well. And then in the Trump administration, it went silent. And so from my perspective, and I'm not going to say there weren't good things that came out of all 3 administrations, right? But as the focus is on issues for Native Americans, it was absent in the Trump administration. And so that's my lens that I have to look through as the leader of a tribal nation, like who is going to be the best for, not on the Republican side, not on the Democrat side, but for the Native American focus. And that's where you see us leaning towards Kamala Harris and what she's done and what she's committed to, and continuing on that legacy that Biden has created.
Right, obviously she's currently vice president, has been a part of that administration. In our last minute here, really quickly though, I want to wrap up. What would you say to, non-native people here in Connecticut, residents, allies, who are maybe looking to learn more about what they can do in terms of support, education? What do you want people to know?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, again, that we are an independent nation. We're a fully functioning government within the government of Connecticut. And so come visit us at, we have cultural events throughout the year. We have the largest Native American museum right here in southeastern Connecticut, largest Native American museum in the world. Come visit us and explore and learn about who we are. And just understand that we are still here, We're going to be here for generations, and we are accretive to the overall cultural and economic value of the state of Connecticut.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're contributing almost $1 billion a year in economic activity to the state of Connecticut, and we're hosting, multiple cultural events and learning opportunities and supporting tourism in Connecticut. Those are the things that we need people to understand when they think of Mashantucket Pequot.
Well, Rodney, thank you so much for taking a couple minutes. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Appreciate it.
Of course. There's still more to get to, though. So much important history here in Connecticut and important futures. You can, of course, find our other coverage of other Indigenous tribes here in our state online and on the Fox 61 News app under the Real Story tab. Don't go anywhere, though. We're talking with our state comptroller, Sean Scanlon, about the upcoming election's impact on our budget from D.C. to Hartford. Plus, with Connecticut's finances in a better place, when might you start feeling that relief? Stay with us.